Welcome to the Effects Loop. I'm Diaz,
I'm Scott.
and we're doing a cool, fun little new segment called Explain It to Me Like I'm Five. So if you've listened to the podcast before, well, if this is your first time listening to the podcast, I would suggest maybe backing up a little bit. This will be really cool too.
Don't start episode one.
Don't start on episode one.
Though we had a really fun theme for a while there of
the Star Wars names.
Yeah. Good thing we ended before they named Last Skywalker, so it wasn't as fun.
Yeah, because then we would have been like the last episode, and we would have had to stop.
Yeah, that might have been for the best.
You guys should stop while you're ahead. You know what? That's actually a smart idea. But we're gonna do this little segment, and a lot of it is based on the fact of, in the dynamic of the podcast, we have me, Jonathan Diaz, who is not formally educated in anything engineering wise with guitars, or even anything guitar related at all. So, but
you said it great one time where you're like, I'm not the best with things like knowledge.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I'm not best with things like knowledge. But I've learned some things over the years, and hanging out with smart people like our friend Scott here, I've picked up some informational things. And you know, it's really cool is because I can, like, whenever someone's like, oh, you play guitar? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh yeah, so what do you like? And I can spit off something smart sounding, and they're just like, oh, I can play Smoke on the Water. Makes me feel good about myself, and it makes me feel sad at the same time. One of the hardest parts is whenever I, like, as much as I love, I obsess over guitars, and I've got a podcast about guitars, and my vacation requests off is purely based around guitar events. When people are like, oh, you play guitar? I do too. And I start talking about like pedals and stuff, and they're just like, oh yeah, no, I got this guitar at Walmart and an amp, and I can play Back in Black. And I'm just like, oh, okay. I hate that moment. Always makes me sad.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably how you feel, like whenever people start talking about stuff and you think they're gonna say something smart, and you're just like, oh.
I mean, there's a lot of moments you experience where people are spouting things as if they're scientific facts, and they're horrendously wrong.
How many times have I like tagged you or screenshotted you, and I'm like, is this even correct? Is this remotely right? Like, listen, I'm not great with things like knowledge, but I know that's not right.
Well, and you know, a hard lesson I've had to learn in my life is no one likes you when you come in and you go, well, actually, no one likes that.
I enjoy it sometimes. So
when you're self-aware about it, yeah.
Yeah. Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about your actual background in this field of science and things?
Yeah, so we often like to say I work in an adjacent industry, right?
Yeah.
So my day job, I lead the Chicago office of an acoustics consulting firm. So while I don't spend as much time being an engineer these days as I used to be, and for reasons we'll get into another discussion, I'm not a professional engineer licensed, but I have engineering degrees and studied acoustics and electrical engineering when I was in school, in kind of a unique program that also brought a lot of formal education into recording. I took a number of recording classes through Purdue's theater department, and
I downloaded Audacity once, so I got that going for me.
I learned on Digital Performer way back when, which I miss every time Pro Tools crashes, like the first 3 iterations of this podcast. Yeah, our intro is getting polished now, isn't it?
Yeah, we're getting good at this.
So yeah, and we're also at the screw it point. So if there's any drop offs in the audio from here on out, sorry, Pro Tools is being a pain in the butt. But yeah, so that's my background is engineering, and then audio, professional audio from an engineering perspective, not just I'm going to tweak some things and make it sound good. Mm-hmm. So I've kind of always approached a lot of these things from kind of half in, half out mindset of like, you know, when I'm playing guitar, I'm not thinking about resistors or, you know, oh, it's the 500 hertz, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, when I'm not holding a guitar in my hands, I tend to think about things very scientifically, if you want to put it that way, or analytically. So I have I often approach things from kind of that engineering perspective, and it's just a different way of sometimes thinking about things. And so, Diaz, you often turn to me, you're like, Scott, explain this to me like I'm 5.
Exactly.
And it's a good opportunity.
Sometimes we have to explain it to me like I'm 3, but that's not the fun type.
And let's use that as the format. Like if I ever get I get too deep in the weeds, you can just be like, Scott, explain this to me like I'm 3.
Yeah.
So you stumbled upon something this week that you're like, Scott, I don't know what I'm talking about here. So,
well, one of the things we talked about it in a past episode, I think it was the last episode you were on.
Yeah.
We talked about the iridium.
Yeah, I think I brought that up.
Yeah, and so that was kind of the thing where we were going in and we started talking about balanced out and all that stuff, and which we'll hit on in a little bit. But looking at this pedal versus, so we got the iridium, and then we started looking at the Joyo preamp house.
Yeah,
and that was really cool. A person brought it up in another group, and it called it the Iridium Killer, capital letters spaced out. And there was a couple things I saw on it that really kind of piqued my interest, and I started talking about it, and then I realized I had no clue. And you actually jumped, and you probably saw me commenting. You're like, hold on,
dude. I comment on your posts so much at this point that I actually get like alerts,
notifications,
where it's like Jonathan Diaz posted a new thing on Facebook. I'm like, what? I'm not that stalkery.
That's kind of stalkery. Jonathan Diaz is making an idiot of himself. Swing in, Scott. Swing in. That's a better notification.
That's the next new feature coming from Facebook.
That's it. But so one of the things so we've got the Joyo Powerhouse. We'll talk a little bit about that. Our preamp house.
Yeah.
This has 9 amps in it. It has a balanced out XLR. It's got a built-in ground lift. It's got a lot of cool things, even has a cab sim. So looking at the iridium, there's besides aesthetics and even some of the guts, but just pure features, there's some different things. The iridium has an IR section, which IR cab sim, there's a difference.
Yes.
Okay. That's one of the things. So let's kind of hit on that. So an IR is an impulse response.
Correct.
And a cab sim is supposed to simulate the way a mic'd cabinet sounds, or close to, I'm guessing.
I mean, that does depend on the intent of how they created that cab sim, right?
Okay.
So like a big complaint with a lot of these things is, oh, it sounds like what you hear at the audio producer desk, or what it sounds like in a studio. It doesn't sound like an amp in a room. Right.
That's a big thing for the Kemper. People talk about that.
Yeah. Well, and that amp in room feel thing is something people bring up all the time. And that's an honest reality here of all these pedals are trying to create the sensation of a mic'd amp. And it's hard to recreate that feel of an amp in a room because, first off, an amplifier going full blast is 100 plus decibels and, all this kind of stuff. Like, it's a lot of sound. And, first things first, we need to remember that the human ear doesn't hear sound the same at different levels. We don't have a flat response ear. There's this concept called the Fletcher-Munson curves. That's a big thing, but it's basically, it's there to say, all right, when something's 50 decibels, the human ear hears things different than when it's 100 decibels. It's almost like having a different EQ curve on your ear.
So just like whenever people say, oh, when I was playing my rig in my bedroom, it sounded amazing, but whenever I got to the venue, it sounded like crap, or vice versa.
That is a factor. That can definitely be a factor in that.
I'd say that's probably a big factor.
There's that, and also just the reality of you're trying to make sound fill a container, right? And your 25 watt amp probably, fills up your bedroom really well.
Right.
But when you get into a big hall for 200 seats or 500 seats or 1,000 seats, depending on how big of a hall you're playing in, or realistically the bar that's 3 times the size of your bedroom, wherever you're playing, it's a different scenario. It's a different room that you're filling up, and the room reacts differently.
Would you say it's kind of like, so imagine if you had like 3 ounces of water in a 3-ounce container, it's going to be full. But if you have a 3 ounces of water in a 20-ounce container, it's going to seem like there's nothing in there. It's going to have a different feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a way to think of it. I would say.
See, I said something that wasn't totally stupid.
Yeah, I mean, I often tell people like, I'm going to get too technical for a minute here, so interrupt me. There's power, right? When you think in terms of physics,
Jesus.
Yeah, there's power.
Sorry.
Your sound source.
I totally derailed you.
You did. The sound. So if you think of a guitar amp as a sound source, it creates a. We talk of these guitar amps in terms of power, and we can get in terms of watts, right? Which is a measurement of power.
Oh gosh, and then you got the tube watts versus solid state watts.
Yeah, let's not go down that road too deeply.
Please not. That's another episode.
And honestly, someone else needs to come in and talk about that one a little bit, because I don't really understand how those things work.
Nick Greer, if you listen to this, come on, buddy.
Oh, that would be a great guy to have on. So if we just talk in simple, like, all right, your guitar amp produces 20 watts, and it goes through a speaker of a certain sensitivity. That creates a sound pressure level that you hear, or SPL, those kind of things. Your ears don't hear power; they hear pressure. That's just the way the ears work. And sound pressure in a room is how much power per square foot or cubic foot of volume you have. And so if you think of it in terms of, I like to talk about it in terms of density, right? A pound of feathers and a pound of lead weigh the same, right?
Correct.
They have the same weight. They have the same mass, but they have different volumes. They fit. So if you want to fill up a pillowcase, putting a pound of lead doesn't work. It's going to be this really small thing. But if you want to fill up a pillowcase with feathers, a pound of feathers will definitely fill up your pillowcase. Does that make sense?
It sure does.
Okay. So if you have, but you have a really dense solid object. So like in the same way, you have a fixed amount of sound power that your amp can put out. So when you're in a really small room, it's going to be physically louder than when you're in a big room, because you have to fill up all that volume of space with power. And so your power density is not as high. Does that make sense?
So the power density is not as high in the big room?
Yes, because you have more volume to fill, right?
Gotcha. Okay, yes. Makes perfect sense.
And so in the same way, now your little amp is not filling up that volume very well.
Right.
So that's a big factor.
Okay, and I forgot how we got on this. So we were talking about...
You were complaining about home tone versus stuff.
Okay. All right. Impulse response. So why don't you explain impulse responses to me? Like I'm 5.
Impulse responses is a fancy way of expressing something that has an input and an output. Literally everything. There are certain rules to what can be described as a with an impulse response and what can't in the electronics world. But there's also this thing called a transfer function out there in the world. I'm not going to get into that deep, but basically an impulse response is what the difference is between what comes in and what comes out of a set device, any type of black box, anything. So the way I like to think of impulse responses is, for guitar players, imagine all your pedals, right? Each individual pedal theoretically has an impulse response to it. Now that's not exactly true, but just think of it that way. Like, I plug into my EQ pedal, it goes in one way and it comes out different. Okay. And there's a change in that system, right? Okay. From what happened before it goes in and when it comes out.
So it's something that's adding a variable that has an in and out. Okay.
It's the easiest way to explain impulse responses in a very simple way. It's different than some other ways of expressing in signals going in and out. But for long and short of it, an impulse response is quite literally the change between a system going in and out. It's a way of expressing it. It's also equivalent to what happens in that system when an impulse hits it. Hence the name, impulse response. It's the response to an impulse. An electronic impulse in electrical engineering world, impulses are infinitely short, infinitely high in level, and has content in every frequency. That's an impulse. So the easiest way to create an impulse is to basically create a static shock or like a blip. Or frankly, most times you listen, if you ever actually open an impulse response and like play it on a computer, it sounds like someone just clapped in a room. Just clap, one click one, and the decay of a system. That's what it sounds like. Because it's actually very similar. Because clapping is very much like creating an impulse in a room. Right, it's infinitely short. It's a lot of energy right all at once. You know, that's what a clap is like.
Okay.
And so that's what that looks like. It's using a special type of math called convolution integration. It's really hard calculus, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, dude, I don't do letters. Like,
yeah.
Sorry.
It's fine. It's by the time I hit convolution, I'd already gone through 3 courses of calculus, linear algebra, and other math courses. So like it is high level stuff, and it's very difficult. I struggled with it a lot in school. So
well, that makes me feel better.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's difficult. It's very it's very intense on like a computer processor to do it in real time.
Okay.
So when
when you're plugging in an impulse response, are they trying to mirror the same response that the cabinet does to sound? How do they like figure that out? Because every impulse response I've seen is trying to make it has like a counterpart. It has like, oh, this is like a 2x12 Mesa something or other. Like, so how are they getting this clap thing to how are they like capturing that sound from the cabinet, or how are they trying to figure out, oh well, this is the way it should go?
It's actually a really interesting question. So remember how I said like it's basically an in and an out of a system?
Yeah.
If you treat that idea of a system, any type of black box, there's all sorts of different ones in the world. And so you can actually create impulse responses of all sorts of things. So like, for example, what I do in my work, I create impulse responses all the time. I create impulse responses of rooms for how a room echoes. And then from that information, I can determine certain criteria of a room from creating an impulse response of what that room sounds like.
Why don't you sell impulse responses of like halls and stuff like that?
Because the reality is that's not what you want.
You don't want like a reverberation out of that?
I mean, I could probably give you a few of a few famous concert halls if you want. They're readily available for free out there in the world. And
but did Scott get them?
No. I mean, the other reality is I switched jobs last year, so I lost access to a lot of information because I didn't take it with me because I was honorable leaving that company.
Oh man, I'm hacking tonight.
Yeah.
I'm gonna watch that movie with Matthew Lillard and Angelina Jolie. Hackers.
Yeah. So when I was talking about like there's a point A to point B, right? That's the impulse response. And so in this situation in the guitar world, we're often thinking of what does it sound like when it leaves the amplifier, hits a speaker, goes out into the real world, and then comes back into a microphone, right?
Right.
That's what we often think of in these terms as these impulse responses. The reality is most of the good impulse responses that you're buying have a little bit more to the system than that, because you can actually have multiple steps in an impulse response. So if you think of it, okay, I've got, your Mesa 4x12 into a Royer 121 microphone, into a Neve console, into this compressor, into this. That's your whole signal chain, right?
Right.
And that all gets captured in that one single impulse response. So you're not creating multiple impulse responses and compounding them on top of each other. You're just doing one fell swoop there of all that content.
Okay.
And it's just the path from A to B. That's what that impulse response is expressing.
Okay, and so a cab sim.
Yes.
What's going on there under the hood?
Generally, so cab sims have been around for a long time too. But the fun thing about cab sims is a lot of them can be done with analog components versus impulse responses require digital processing. Flat out.
Okay.
There's no way to do impulse response convolution with an analog circuit. It requires a processor, which is why we're suddenly seeing them like really crop up. It's a matter of technology. The processors finally got good enough to do that in real time in an affordable way. But impulse responses have been around for decades, just not real time processing of that, right? Like it takes me 10 minutes to process an impulse response on my old crappy computer, back in the day when I ran that software on a Windows XP machine.
Good old Windows XP.
Yeah. Whereas now we can just run it real time. It's great. So when we get into cab sims, right, that's analog circuits making an approximation of how a cab will sound. We know that speakers don't produce sound perfectly, right? There's
I didn't know that.
So yeah, that's what separates all. That's why we have all these different speakers, because all of them imperfectly recreate sound.
Okay.
Some do it better than others. Some require multiple speakers. Like if you look at studio monitors, usually there's a tweeter and a woofer. That small little speaker that does high frequencies, and the bigger speaker that does the lower frequencies, right? And that's science. It's almost impossible to create flat response sound.
So FR speakers are a myth? Get out of town.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that, but
if it was true FR, it wouldn't matter what company you got it from because it'd still sound the same, correct?
Yes, if it was a perfect speaker, yes.
Exactly, but there are no perfect speakers, as we learned here today from Mr. Scott Hamilton.
Yeah, actually, the reality is the more expensive speakers get, the less accurate they actually are.
Oh, so my head rush is not that horrible.
Well, I mean, it's diminishing returns. Like there's the cheap speakers don't do a very good job, and then they kind of hit a really nice point where they do a really accurate job, and then the really like the $100,000 speakers are actually not flat, are actually less flat than the cheaper speakers in terms of response because they're sweetening the sound and adding things.
Oh,
so yeah. When we think about like an Alnico Blue or a Greenback or a Vintage 30, all these different speakers, they produce sound differently, right? That's why cabs sound different when you add a different cab to it. For lack of a better term, you could think of it as an EQ.
Okay.
Like it's more precise than like the 5-band EQ pedal you get from Boss, but there's an equalization. So what comes in the levels get unbalanced when they go through a speaker.
Okay.
As you're transitioning that electrical energy into acoustic energy in the real world. So a cab sim will approximate some of that stuff, all the EQing that happens in that process, and often that can be done with a fairly reasonable analog circuit. But cab sims have been around since 80s. I mean, think back to the old Tech 21 stuff. That was all cab sim.
Yeah. Dude, I love Tech 21. I've got the Liverpool I've been using a lot, and that's got the cab sim built in, and that thing sounds sweet.
Yeah, I mean, this is not new tech when you see CapSim.
It's just been improved upon.
Yeah, and so actually what's interesting now is when you think about now that digital processors are coming to cheaper markets, right? You could do a digital EQ circuit and get a really accurate EQ that's really precise and finite and does all that work without as much processing power as an impulse response. So that's why they're cheaper still. I mean, it is a cheaper option to do.
Yeah. All right. So one of the things that you said a word that was kind of this was what the whole comment really came from. Well, no, this is part of what I was thinking about. One of the things that's been, I don't know if it's been a complaint, it's been a reservation for me on the Iridium, is it's not balanced out. And I've tried to understand it, and I still just can't wrap my mind around it. So Scott, explain it to me like I'm five. What's the difference between a balanced out and an unbalanced out?
The type of cable that's used.
That's it?
They are different cables. They're different standards. They're different formats.
But you can have a 1/4 inch balanced out, correct?
You can. But I think you know the answer to this already. It requires a different type of plug.
Right. So why do you think Strymon would not put a balanced out? Or so if you have an unbalanced out, can you plug directly into the board or like a powered speaker? Or well, I know you could probably
you can.
Direct.
You absolutely can. There are issues with it.
Okay.
You know, I think I also made that complaint of like, why wouldn't they do this?
Well, actually, I saw your complaint and I had jumped on the bandwagon. I was like, yeah, what are they thinking? And Scott will explain it to me later. I think that's kind of how it went for me, actually.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the common thing a lot of us have seen is a lot of acoustic guitar pickups, right? Systems are still 1/4 inch unbalanced. And we all have seen these direct boxes that get dropped on the floor in front of us. And you plug into that, and then a microphone cable comes out of it, right?
Right.
Because we're used to these 1/4 inch guitar cables that are really actually crappy technology, but we insist on continuing to use it because reasons. Because whenever Gibson comes up with a solution for it, we abhor it. So
I know that's right. Oh no, you hate tuning your guitar? We'll make robot tuners. This sucks.
Well, if I recall correctly, the first robot also had an Ethernet jack out, like that cable that you use for internet. It used one of those cables instead, and people hated it because it just added devices to your system. But we also
you said it had that instead of a 1/4 inch?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think they had both. There's no way they put out a guitar with only Ethernet cable.
You had to use an adapter into regular 1/4 inch. But yeah,
no.
There was one. No. I'm not going to get into arguing that one because like I don't know which model it was, but I thought it was the first robot.
I'm looking it up. I'm sorry.
Like this is before they made the robot tuners standard on like the guitars. It was like they're like custom shop one that could self-tune, and everyone's like, oh, that's a cool proof of concept.
Okay, here's one that's got Ethernet. The HD.6X Pro. Hold on, I need to look at.
Okay.
Where's
here? Sorry. Let's. Why don't you keep?
Oh, it did have a 1/4. It had a classic mode, is what it was called.
Classic mode.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So we've seen that scenario, right, with an acoustic guitar player plugging into a direct box, and sometimes they'll bring like a Boss tuner in, and they'll just put a TU2 or TU3 in that line and whatever. And then Taylor kind of screwed things up, if you remember right, with the original ES system had a TRS jack on it instead of a regular standard 1/4 inch. And every Taylor guitar came with a cable that went from TRS 1/4 inch into an XLR. And so everyone's like, what? I don't need a direct box anymore. I can just plug into a mic cable. That's awesome. Until everyone started complaining about the Taylor ES system later.
Right.
But that was kind of an innovation that they brought on that still hasn't totally kicked into the acoustic guitar world. And those systems are different. But what they did was they moved from what's called an unbalanced plug, which is what the normal thing in the world is, in the guitar world we're used to a balanced plug. And what that does, there's a reason. There's actually a lot of reasons why that's done, particularly in the electric guitar world, is to run balanced signals, you need more circuitry. Just flat out, you do. And so, like, you ever open up even the most basic microphone, there's usually a bit of circuit. There's a preamp circuit already in there to do stuff and actually make it into a balanced signal that goes out.
Okay.
Whereas you open up a guitar and there's literally three wires, period, in those things, and it's like guitars are extremely simplistic circuitry, right?
In the grand scheme of things, yes. But for me, they're complicated.
Yeah. So there are advantages to unbalanced signal, or to balanced signal. Let me correct that. And it's the preference to run balanced audio everywhere, in a pro audio environment, because balanced cables are more resistant to noise from the outside world. So I think go ahead.
So one of the things that when you run like a speaker cable, is a speaker cable usually balanced?
No, a speaker cable is unbalanced as well.
Huh. Well, I'll have to ask you later how come people are like, well, why can't you use an instrument cable to connect your head to your cab if it's tube? Like, people freak out about that.
Wait, what?
I've had people like get all antsy about using a normal guitar cable to like run your tube head to your cab.
Oh, yeah, those are different still. An instrument cable and a speaker cable are different as well.
Gosh dang it.
Both are unbalanced.
Both are unbalanced. Okay. I'm unbalanced too, so that works out.
So,
and then,
yeah,
go ahead.
If you were to take a scissors right now and cut a microphone cable open, a guitar cable open, and a speaker cable open, and look at them. First off,
hold on, let me get my scissors.
Yeah, a guitar cable is coaxial, i.e., there is a conductor, like a chunk of copper right down the center.
Right, just like your antenna cable, stuff like that.
Sort of, but yes, well, they're both coaxial cable styles. Yes.
I'm 5 years old.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. Generally equivalent. If I remember right, internet cable has a solid core, so it's just like one wire, whereas it's braided, so it's a lot of little strands together, and your instrument cable. So it bends really nicely. And then there's a chunk of rubber or some type of insulator, and then there's a braided shield or a wrapped shield, i.e. all of the second cable that's in that, because there's two conductors. That whole secondary part wraps all around that center core without ever touching it.
Okay.
That's called a coaxial cable. There are noise benefits from running coaxial cable. That there's noise benefits from it, because there are electrical signals out in the world from radio, television, your cell phone, radiation from things. There's a lot of stuff out there in the world in the electrical spectrum, and it influences our electronics. It gets into the system, without getting into much more physics than that. But there's a reason why we can pick up radio signals on guitars that don't have their grounding right. Seriously, they turn into antennas.
Oh no, I know. I've had random people going, there's a goal. I was like, there's Spanish soccer coming through my guitar.
Yeah, and so that's usually due to a bad cable, more often than not. So if you look at that's a coaxial cable with an instrument cable. When you get into a balanced cable, what you'll find is that same shield, that wraparound, is still happening. And that's your ground. But instead of having one signal cable, there are two cables inside that center, usually braided between each other. Sometimes they're braided, sometimes they're just run parallel. through that center channel.
Okay.
And what happens is on the electronic side, typically those two cables are carrying the same signal, but out of phase with each other perfectly.
Okay.
And so when one is going plus in the direction, the other one's going the opposite direction with the same amount of amplitude. So if you're sending something that was one positive 1 volt at the same time, the other one's going negative 1 volt.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can get into wave cancellation and stuff at another session.
Yeah.
Because this is getting really long already. But what that does is when those two are run at opposite polarities like that, any noise that gets induced into the system gets induced to it opposite each other. So one gets it in one polarity, one gets it into the other polarity. So what happens at the other end is that polarity inversion gets inverted again. So what you should be doing now is you're adding two signals back to each other perfectly in phase.
Okay.
And all the noise is now perfectly out of phase with itself and cancels itself out.
Okay, that's cool. So whenever one of the main things on this though is, like, I'm 5. I want you to tell me why is it that it's more beneficial for a direct rig to run balanced out?
So remember that thing I was just talking about, how noise is getting eliminated from the signal?
Yeah.
That lets you run really long cables without getting noise interference.
Okay, and then so one of the things is, especially whenever you're running into that direct box and then having to run that direct box out, and it's on the Joyo, what is it, the preamp house, there's a ground lift.
Yep.
What is that? Pretty much activating the cancellation? Or because I know the way I remember it is, I'm standing next to a bass player and they're like, there's a lot of hum, hit the ground lift, and he hits it and it's gone.
Yeah. So remember how I was
saying, open up another can of worms?
Remember how on a balanced cable there were actually three connectors, right? There's the two in the center with the polarity inversion, and then there's the shield on the outside.
Right.
That shield is the ground, or connected to ground. What that does, the ground lift, it disconnects the ground at that side.
Okay.
Which forces electrical signals to find different routes through a system. But long and short of it is, if you have too many grounds in a system, or different paths to ground, it can cause what's called ground loops, which means electrons are traveling in that system, electrical signals are traveling in that system in a route you don't want.
So, and that's a common thing you hear about ground loops whenever, your pedal board and your amp are plugged into, to the same outlet?
It can happen that way. What more likely happens when you're dealing with ground loops with guitar amps are either you're running one of those SGI box things to run your guitar amp remotely, and you're on two separate electrical ground circuits, and now you're having ground loops, or you're using two amps. Like my Fender and my Vox together create a ground loop.
Okay.
And when they get plugged together, they just start creating this crazy howl until I put a ground lift into the system. And you can get away with doing that in a lot of these systems because there's a transformer in it. That's really what happens. It's not you're cutting a cord often. You're using a transformer to separate something while still allowing audio to pass through. You're getting rid of the direct current connection.
Okay. Very cool. All right. And then there was another thing, and then we're going to talk about which one of these you think is actually kind of the best. But let me pull it back up. You haven't heard either of them in person yet, have you?
I've not tried either in person. I have not actually heard a demo of the Joyo yet, so I can't really talk.
Okay, so we won't talk about that.
Okay.
Well, all right, we'll talk about features only.
Okay.
So one of the things we've got the balanced out.
Yeah.
The last thing that was of what I consider like a big difference, the Joyo has an effects loop.
Yeah, that
which is really great. Because all right, and so I'm gonna tell you how I thought about it. I want you to tell me if I was completely like way off or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I thought about it is, for some in my head, and I'm thinking strictly signal chain, like if you were just to write it all down completely.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine I would want to put some of my modulations before my like after the like preamp, but before what's the cab sim, before the speaker.
Yeah. Which is common in high-end guitar amps, right? You have a break between the preamp and the power amp, right?
Yeah.
And so you get all your overdrive from your preamp, and then you can run those sparkly effects cleanly, because usually your power amp doesn't distort that much. Right. Usually.
So, but am I incorrect in thinking it's going to sound different if I was to run, like, say, a delay? Well, we'll do like a modulated delay. It's going to sound, in my mind, I would imagine it would sound quite a bit different, or it might just be a little bit. If I was to run it in the effects loop after the preamp and everything, before the speaker sim, or it would sound different than if I was to just run the speaker sim out into the modulated delay.
It can. It can, and here's why. Is a lot of those speaker sims are trying to add a little bit of reverb into the equation.
Okay.
Right? That it's creating that room feel, or like just that
amp and room feel that everyone's wanting to get.
Or just the reality of, like, when you mic up a guitar amp in a studio, you're getting some room in the sound, no matter how close to the amp you get that microphone. Right?
But I feel like the effects loop is really a big positive thing, because I don't know if you'd want to run a balanced out into some of these guitar pedals. Would they have an adverse effect? It would be
remarkably hard to do that.
Okay.
And it also depends. So there's a few different standards for running audio signals. So I don't know if you've ever seen instrument level or line level written on anything ever. Yeah. Line level runs at a higher voltage. Okay. So it's just going to be loud running at line level.
And if I was to run at line level into like a reverb or something, it could cause distortion.
Could,
like unwanted distortion.
If you have a weird headroom kind of thing. Like, for example, I use an analog delay, right? So I have a total recall. That thing overdrives. So, like, if I'm running a boost too hard into it, it will start overdriving and oscillating. So that's the equivalent. Like, if I'm running line level into that thing, I'm going to blow it out.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the big concerns, because we were talking, and Cole Duke was talking about that, and Cole, who's also in the same field as you, and you said Cole actually has some background in this stuff.
Yes,
we were discussing.
Cole's a smart guy.
You know what? It's really funny, because me and Cole used to not get along, and now we kind of do get along. And I realized he's not a total doucher.
Oh, he's actually a really nice guy. I can say that confirmed. I've met him in person. Great guy. Great guy. Super
fantastic, chill. Fantastic guy.
But like Cole and I have a professional relationship as well. Like, I send him stuff periodically that's like work related. So, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. But that was one of the things I kind of was excited about. Was I figured the effects would be really cool, because I just imagined with a balanced out, it would kind of distort. But with the Iridium being an unbalanced out,
Sorry, Diaz, I lost you.
It's all good. I'm here.
All right. So you said with the Iridium being an unbalanced out. You want to just start that sentence over again?
Yeah. So with the Iridium being an unbalanced out, would that cause that you feel that would reduce the chance of overdriving or causing distortion, because it's not, that would be instrument level, right? Unbalanced out.
I'm assuming the iridium goes instrument level out, or there's a switch on it. You often see a switch on these things that will say line level or instrument level, and it's a physical switch you gotta kick on.
Yeah.
I also don't know why it would run unbalanced line level out. I don't see that as being a realistic scenario. I think with the iridium, they just thought, all right, some people are going to throw this in their pedal board in a normal chain, and some people are going to run this into an amp for whatever reason, and it's just there as a backup if they got to plug in direct. I think that's what they were thinking in it, and so they were trying to. A lot of the things in the iridium are really kind of dummy proofed. Like, it's really usable is what I'm hearing from a lot of people. Like, they're like, I just plug it in and it works, no dialing.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing is they kind of they really apparently hit these tones that they're shooting for. They had like a Vox tone, a Fender tone, and a Marshall tone.
That took no effort. Like, I haven't heard anyone make it sound bad yet.
I don't think I have either. Well, there's been a few. But it probably was production wise or something like that. Yeah. But Ryan at 60 Cycle Hum did a really great demo of it, and it has a really good sound. All three voicings, in my opinion, though, sound somewhat similar, but also it's.
Are you talking about Ryan's demo?
Yeah, he used the same IR on all of them, though, didn't he?
No, each mode has different IRs. They have 3 IRs per mode that are uniquely different. Part of that is just like, I think you're hearing a lot of just Ryan's playing style that just transcends whatever amp he's using.
I don't have the acoustical engineer yet.
Okay.
I'm going to night school for that. Actually, I just sit around and drink and listen to Pink Floyd. Same thing. So,
I mean, I took one of my classes was with Bruford Jones.
I don't know who that is.
Pink Floyd's front of house engineer.
Oh yeah, because
he did the wall tour with them. He's the guy who did the quadraphonic sound thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, what about Quadrophenia with by the Who?
I don't know that one well.
You don't know that? Okay, you're gonna have to check out that album.
It's on the list for tonight. Okay, so going back to the Iridium's original idea, I really think it was supposed to be. They tried to make it simpler and more of a Swiss Army knife for everybody. That it's more meant as the backup solution than it's meant to be the primary thing, even though it sounds so stinking good.
I don't like that though. I don't feel like Strymon should ever shoot to be second. You don't want to be the backup choice to the prom.
But here's the thing. Like what would you do if you wanted to use an amp for one gig? You maybe had a backline for another one, and maybe you had something else. And I think on the Iridium, you can turn the impulse responses on and off and the amp on and off, right? That's what the 2 buttons are for?
Yes.
Okay, so the idea being, okay, you're showing up for a gig and someone gave you a Hot Rod Deluxe and you're a Vox guy, right?
Right.
So what you do is you take the Iridium, you skip the cab sim, and you plug into the power amp out, or power amp. Anyway, the effects loop return on the Hot Rod Deluxe. You have a Vox sound coming from your Hot Rod Deluxe.
You know what? Okay, thank you for explaining that to me like I'm 5, because that is actually a good idea, because you're getting your preamp from the Iridium, and you're using the power amp pretty much so you're pretty much just like hijacking the speakers and the power to boost it. Yeah,
and then you're going and then you're going to another gig and no backline shows up, but you can plug into front of house and the sound system's good enough to be for that system. Cool. You plug that. Any venue you go to is going to have a bunch of direct boxes, so you can just plug right into them, no problems, no whips or dongles or anything. Like, that's the big complaint with the HX Stomp, is if you want balanced outs of them, you have to have a TRS to XLR adapter.
Right. And
everyone's like, where the heck do I get these? And the answer is always
go to the Line 6 website and pay like $25.
That's right, because that cable company that I was going to say doesn't pay us yet. Oh
yeah.
Actually, hang on. Never mind. I was going to say our other sponsor has released a cable, but I don't think he's done that type of cable yet.
No, he's not. I think he's sticking to pretty much a standard cable.
Yeah. Okay. anyway, that you need an uncommon cable. I mean, you can go buy one at Guitar Center, but like,
Okay.
I have 2 or 3 of them that are like 2-footers that I have for other uses. I have them for my sound card because my sound card is TRS outs. Anyway, so like that was a complication, and people were like, I got to put a lot of work into the HX Stomp to get sounds out of it. The Iridium, you literally plug it in and it works.
Right.
And you're done. Now, the Joyo preamp house, right? That has an XLR out. So that's essentially, does it actually have a normal 1/4 inch out?
I believe it does, actually.
I only saw the
believe it has
effects loop
both.
on the back. Does it actually have an output on the back too?
Oh, wait. No.
Yeah, it does, because
No.
there's 4.
Oh, does it? All right, well, there's
4
an
outputs on it.
in, an effects loop, and an out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're running that amp situation, I'd hope that output on the preamp house skips some of the electronics in it, or
Okay.
something like that. Anyway, but the reality is, they're running stereo on the Iridium versus the preamp house is mono,
Okay.
and you can do a stereo input into the Iridium, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
You need an insert thing where it goes 2 cables into a TRS, but that's solvable. But it lets the Iridium stay as a Swiss Army knife. Now, I would still like it to be TRS for whatever reason I want it to be, mainly if I'm recording at home with it. But
Yeah.
that's such a short cable run that an unbalanced cable is okay.
Right.
But like,
Okay.
I can't run to front of house a big 200-foot, cable run realistically. I should not be
Right.
using an unbalanced cable to run that whole length. So you
Yeah, 'cause
should
you're
be
gonna have
plugging
sound
in.
degradation.
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna wrap this up. Scott, I'm gonna let you pick first, and then I'll tell you what I'm gonna pick. Based purely on the features, not the sounds, because you haven't heard the Joyo.
Yep.
And not the brand, but
Yep.
purely based on features. Which one would you pick?
Right now, I would lean towards the Iridium.
Okay. I would probably go towards the Joyo. It's got a few more amp choices. I do like the XLR out and being able to run the effects loop and just using that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's, and then you've also got the 1/4 out if you want. So honestly, like I know direct boxes are everywhere on that, but sometimes it's just so much easier just to run that XLR cable, plug it in, unplug it, and go.
Totally understandable.
So, yeah. Oh, and also, one of the cool things on this is that it's got the clean and distortion channels for all the amps.
That's pretty cool.
And which we didn't mention, and also, so you have access to 2 channels. So like you could do a clean Fender on one side, on one button, and like a distorted Marshall on the other, or a crunchy Marshall. So I feel like that's really cool. We didn't mention that.
Yeah.
But I think that's really neat. I think they're both really cool, and I mean, it's pretty awesome. So the amps, we talked about the amps on the Iridium were the Fender style, the Vox style, and a Marshall style. On the Joyo is a 65 twin, a JCM 900, an AC30, a Lone Star, a dual rectifier, a 5153, Powerball, a TH200, and a BE100. Which I feel like the BE100 is kind of weird, because isn't that just like a modded Marshall, like a JCM 900?
I thought the BE100 is a Plexi. No.
Maybe it is Plexi. I don't know. But it's I just think it's pretty cool on the Joyo. There's quite a few amps. Now, overall sound, I'm gonna guess that the Strymon gonna sound better, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, and but yeah, I think they're both really cool. Yeah. But Scott, once again, thank you for explaining to me like I'm 5.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with, if we, those companies want us to do a shootout, effectsloop@gmail.com.
That's right. Do the shootout. It'll be great. It'll be fun. But all right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us on our first volume of Explain It to Me Like I'm 5. For the Effects Loop, I'm Diaz.
I'm Scott.
And we'll see you later.
Bye.
How long was that? Like, felt like an hour.
It's about an hour.
Oh my gosh.